Julian. Turning then to Ms. Martin, Executive Director, Women's Shelters Canada. Lisa?
Thank you very much for this invitation. My name is Lise Martin, and I am the Executive Director of Women's Shelters Canada. I come to you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We are a national organization representing the 500 and plus violence against women's shelters and transition houses across the country. The pandemic has had devastating impacts on women experiencing abuse. In the context of stay-at-home orders, home is far from safe for a number of women and their children. With the introduction of the stay-at-home orders last spring, shelters, along with our provincial shelter associations, were quick to point out that if home was not safe, you did not need to stay, that help was available. Throughout all phases of the ongoing pandemic, Canada's 550 plus shelters have remained open. I will focus my intervention on the federal program to provide emergency COVID funding to gender-based violence organizations. More specifically, the funds provided to shelters and transition houses. In total, $100 million was provided. The first $50 million was announced in late March 2020, while the second $50 million was announced in late October. In late March of 2020, the Department for Women and Gender Equality reached out to us to discuss the possibility of having our organization distribute the funds earmarked to shelters. Although the distribution of funds is not part of our mission, we knew that we had the most accurate and up-to-date information on shelters. We knew that shelters needed funds ASAP. And finally, we knew that our small but mighty team could take this on. We distributed $20.5 million to shelters in the spring of 2020 and a further $15.7 million in December. These funds were provided to 385 shelters. On average, each shelter received $90,000 distributed over 3 transfers. The shelters very much appreciated these funds at this time of unprecedented crisis. The impacts on shelters were numerous. What Melpa has described has occurred in shelters across the country. The federal emergency COVID funds were able to respond to a very real and immediate need. You will recall that the WHO declared the pandemic on March 11, 2020. Between April 13th and 24th, we were able to provide initial funds into the bank accounts of most of Canada's shelters. Women's Shelters Canada provided funds to all shelters with the exception of those funded by Indigenous Services Canada and those within the province of Quebec, where the distribution was made by the provincial government. We did and continue to be concerned about shelters in Quebec who had to wait much longer to receive these crucial emergency funds. In the first wave, Quebec shelters did not receive funds before mid-June. Whereas our final third round of disbursement was made in late December prior to the Christmas holidays, shelters in Quebec are only now beginning to receive their third installment. The funding program was designed with a great deal of flexibility, allowing it to respond to the very different needs across the country. In terms of the funds that were announced in late October, we were able to negotiate the deadline for funds to be spent. It is September 30th, 2021, rather than the usual March 31st. Last fall, we argued convincingly that the pandemic would not end on March 31st, which clearly it has not. There were, however, a number of cases where bureaucratic rules superseded logic. Namely, the fund did not allow for capital investment. For example, we received a request from a shelter in a remote area of the Yukon who asked if funds could be put towards the purchase of a vehicle to transport women. There are huge transportation barriers in the north and in our rural and remote communities. The response was that such an expense could not be covered, but that they could make use of taxis and this would be covered. Well, there are no taxis in this community, and shelters often need to get women in the middle of the night and often at great distances. A number of shelters reached out asking about building an additional bathroom, converting an office into a bathroom, for example. Unfortunately, all of these requests were turned down because of Treasury Board guidelines that did not adapt to these exceptional circumstances. Let me now turn to what comes next. The pandemic has highlighted that gender-based violence increases in times of crisis and how fragile our systems and services to respond were and are. This needs to change. Gender-based violence levels won't go back down after the pandemic. More than ever, we need strong and well-funded services and prevention initiatives to deal with the now and to strengthen our response capabilities for future crises. We, as organizations supporting shelters, as well as the shelters themselves, need stable and ongoing funding. In our 2019 More Than a Bed report, 74% of violence against women shelters indicated that insufficient funding was a major challenge. 64% did not receive a regular annual cost of living increase. Within this context, it is extremely challenging to remunerate shelter workers wages that reflect their levels of expertise. A recent study from our member in Alberta showed that the women's shelters workforce earned less and worked longer hours than the average worker in an equivalent role in the province's nonprofit and public sectors. As the pandemic has shown, a sector is only as strong as its people. Earlier this week, we welcomed the federal budget, which included the first investments into Canada's National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence, a plan for which we have been advocating since 2013. It is definitely a major step forward. We have, however, clearly indicated that a fully national action plan will require billions, not millions. Gender-based violence is a systemic issue that requires systemic solutions. Thank you, and I look forward